Welcome to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. I am your host, Molly Southgate, and today I'm interviewing
Tobi Ogundiran.
Hi, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
Of course, thank you for coming on the show. So, can you tell me a little bit about your books?
Yes. So, the Guardian of the Gods duology, which started last year with In the Shadow of the Fall and ends this year in a week, actually, with At the Founts of Creation, is a story really about truth and secrets and lies and the delicate balance in which they all exist. It mainly follows an acolyte who is training in a temple to become a priestess so she can serve her gods like everyone else, but for some reason she's been unable to graduate and go out into the world to serve her gods. And how they graduate really is that you have a god speak to you, choose you to become their priest and whatnot. So she decides to take matters into her own hands and decides to build a statuette really to trap the soul of a god and ask questions like, why haven't you all chosen me? But in the process of the ritual, she instead experiences a vision that is so terrible it draws the attention of a powerful enemy sect. And she finds herself thrust into this decades, centuries old war between gods and mortals and those who are out to get them. Um, yeah, that's the longest short of it.
Oh, that's such an amazing concept. So, where did that come from? What inspired it?
That's a good question. I think it really was a confluence of various sources of inspiration. The first being that I'd always wanted to write about gods, about Yoruba gods, which are the gods of my culture. Um, and I, because they're pretty similar. The gods in this pantheon are pretty similar to the gods of, say, the Norse gods or the Greek gods, who have the god of thunder, god of beauty, and all that. But I didn't just want to write yet another story about gods, but have them not be Western god. I spent a lot of time searching for the right entry point, the right story to tell. And sometime in 2020, I think, I was reading the works of Ursula Le Guin, specifically The Tombs of Atwan, which also has a woman who's been dedicated to this temple of gods. And that really served as an entry point for me to access Ashâke's story. And yeah, it just all clicked from there, I guess. And I began to draft the story.
That is so cool. So, at what point did you know that you were writing a duology?
Mm. I well, it's the story as a whole started out as a short story, which got published in 2020, I think. But I always knew there was more to the story. I really wanted to explore the world, the characters, all the ideas that I sort of planted in the original short story. And then I decided to write a novella, which it was mostly for a host of different reasons, but mainly because a novella is shorter to write and it's easier, less time commitment than a full length novel. So the first book really can be taken as the first act of the entire story. So I knew on some level that it was going to be a story in two parts, a complete story, but sort of split into two parts, hence the duology.
It's interesting because it kind of sounds like it went through every stage of being a novel where you've got like a
Yeah,
short story and a novella and like where it started. That's interesting, an interesting progression for it.
exactly. And yeah, I'm really happy with how it turned out. I really had the time to, ruminate on the story, think about the themes and the ideas I was trying to pass across, and from short story to novellas, which on some level is like a novel split into halves. So yeah.
Interesting. So yeah, you know, that actually leads us perfectly into what my next question was going to be, which is I'd like to know more about some of the themes that you find popping up across these two books and across all of your writing and your short stories. Is there
Mm,
any through line?
that's a good one. A through line. I think like readers and reviewers or critics would be better positioned to answer this question, but I'm going to take a stab at it anyway. Um, Mainly truth, and the various ways it could be manipulated by different factions, say in society, which I guess is an idea that's really prevalent in our current times, um, but also secrets and knowledge, and who gets to have knowledge and who gets to not have knowledge, who's dispossessed, disenfranchised by the lack of knowledge, and how that really feeds into each individual and the trajectory of their lives, the various decisions they make. Something else that's prevalent in both books is the idea of destiny. That is, do does each person, each individual, have a set destiny, and it doesn't really matter whatever course you take over the course of your life, whatever decisions you make over the course of your lives, you are tied, for better or for worse, to a set destiny, or are we really in charge of our lives? And every little decision we make, does that sort of change the trajectory of our lives? Yeah, I have no answers for that, no definite answers, but it was a really interesting concept to explore in the book. Yeah,
Well, I think that's why we write fiction too, is when we don't have the answers, trying to look for those. And for
absolutely.
me, larger themes such as that, it's like you need an outlet to
Yeah.
process and look through and really investigate these things.
Yes, yes. And I think the best fictions are those that raise these questions and have folks think about the questions long after the story is ended. Have people engage in really lively, spirited discussions on the questions raised. So that's what I hope, my books achieve in the minds of the readers. Yeah.
That is fantastic. Yeah, I love asking that question. I've been asking it a lot lately because every answer I get is so unique to the author. It's a
Yes.
it's like a surprisingly personal question. I think you can learn a lot about the intention of a book and
Hmm.
what it informs you as a reader as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I agree.
So, I'd like to know more about you as a writer. How did you start writing?
Mm, I've been writing, if my parents are to be believed, ever since I could hold a pen. But my own first, I guess, conscious attempts to write were when I was back in high school, when Harry Potter was all the rage. I wrote a thinly veiled pastiche of Harry Potter. And what was interesting, because I went to boarding school, and, we had no phones, we're allowed no phones, and we only had the computer lab to access the internet and all that. So reading was really encouraged, and really that was how we could pass the time. So I started to write. I'll write a chapter, I'll write longhand, and it got to a point where my friends were taking turns, really interested in seeing what I was coming up with. So getting in line just to see each new chapter I managed to write. And you can imagine that did wonders for my ego. So that's, I guess, my first attempt at writing. Eventually, I graduated from the fan fiction into writing my own original works. Tried my hands at various genres. I really had the burning itch to tell stories. It really didn't matter what genre. And I knew I wanted to be published, not just have my friends and family read my work. I wanted a vast, a greater audience. So I kept at it all through high school, college, grad school, kept writing until I found my big break, I guess, so to speak.
Now,
Yeah.
you've also written several like acclaimed short stories in addition to the novels, and
Yes.
you're saying that you don't really care like what genre or whatever, however to tell the story, but how do you figure out how to tell the story?
Hmm. That is how to tell the story as regards length, short story, or novel, or just how to tell the story in general.
Length or genre, whatever that
Hmm.
means to you.
I guess the story presents itself to me in the way it wants to be told. That's really how I can explain that. Usually, I know when I have an idea, the format is going to be in, if this is a short story idea, or if there's something that requires much more deep exploration of the themes and the plot and all that. And I do say I'm not married to a genre, but of course I can't deny that most of what I write is has a tinge of the fantastical or skews somewhat darkish or horrorish, which is, I mean, I have no qualms about that, and that's just, I guess, my mode of expression. But really, a story excites me when it's unexpected and leads me in directions I never would have thought of if I sat down and actively brainstormed about a theme or an idea.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So to bring it back sort of to what we were talking about earlier, how you incorporate myth into your stories, I'm interested in what that research process looks like for you.
Mm. I I should say I never really or actively research. So there's no moment where I'm like, I shall not sit down and research. Research happens organically, and it occurs more to fit the story. So say I'm writing about, and I guess this also is a product of the kind of stories I tell, which might take place in the world as we know, but is not 100% representation of the real world. It's a fantastical version of the world, or it's a secondary world fantasy, which doesn't really require that much research, but much more, artistic world building in that sense. Um, but again, in some instances, say I am writing a novel at present, which has required me to do some research, in part because it's an alternate history kind of novel. So yes, there are historical elements, there are recognizable locales and events, but of course I'm twisting them in a slight way to serve the story. But there are standard pointers or markers in history, which I had to research just to get, to inject some flavor or realism into the story. So I had to search, when were daguerreotypes invented, the precursor to modern photography? When were telegrams invented? Things like that. What are the practices of 18th century nobility in England? And yeah, but again, the research isn't always front loaded in that I don't do a research and then start working on the project. I start writing, and in the process of drafting, if I come upon a scene that requires a bit of research, I pause, go into Google, search whatever it is I want to search, and then come back and fill it in. Which might not, some writers might cringe at that and say that's not the most efficient way, of drafting. You want to draft without any distractions, but that works for me, and that's what I do.
You know what? I am the same exact way in my own writing as well. Because I find that if I front load the research, then
Mhm.
I get too excited and I only research and I never write anything.
Yes, yes. And you do so much research, you have all this juicy material, you try to squeeze every bit of what you found out into the story, which might not necessarily serve the story.
Definitely. So now I really want to know what is your opinion on outlining? Do you kind of take the same approach or do you do that before?
I don't outline. I'm what you call a discovery writer. I have an idea or the first couple of scenes, which again, I am a visual writer, so the first scenes really come to me like a motion picture or whatever in my head. And I really am just transcribing what I see in my mind's eye onto the page. So I don't outline because I don't want to know where the destination, because that for me takes out the fun, the journey. I want to It's like picking up a book and you really don't know how it ends as a reader. That's the joy in going on that journey. So for me as a writer, at least for the first drafts, that's where that joy and the journey comes into play. Once I'm done with the first draft, then I go back and reread and perhaps then restructure and outline in retrospect just to make things, just to make it seem like I knew right from the start what exactly I was doing. Yeah, but outlining right off the bat, no, I don't do that.
Well, it's like the best foreshadowing trick is that you write the
Yes,
entire book and then you go back and add in
exactly.
everything
Exactly.
else and act like it was there all along.
Yep. Yep. That's what I do.
Now, this is something I've had a lot of authors say, but do you feel like the characters are almost making the decisions in the book, or do you feel like you're in the driver's seat?
Hmm. Yeah, that is a, and I'm sure you get different answers from different authors, and each we all have our different philosophies, I guess. For me, I want to say it's a mix of both. Um, the characters never just run away from me and or act out their own desires and whatnot. What I try to do is put them in such a situation, in an organic as possible situation, and sort of watch them react to circumstances. Um, when I've also found, on the other hand, that when I try to shoehorn, when I have a set destination in mind or a plot, and I try to force it on the characters, the story ends up coming out stilted and stale and not really enticing or getting. So it's kind of a fine, really delicate balancing act between having the characters do what I want them to do versus having them react and respond as naturally as possible to certain events or situations in a story. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think it goes back to what we were saying even earlier about like what you were saying about writing, the outlines and research and everything. All of writing is such a balance.
Yes, yes, and that's where the fun comes in. It's yeah, because you are making a thousand and one decisions really in the process of drafting this story, and everything comes to bear really at the end, and every decision is important and really, it's I liken it to sculpture. You have a piece of marble, and the sculptor is chipping away at the block and chipping away and chipping away. And the joy of creation comes from that process. And you really get to discover the story you're trying to tell. You come to understand the character, their different voices, their personalities, and the goals and everything. And that's where being a creator, so to speak, really comes out.
Mhm. Well, on the subject of being a creator, as I was researching you, I saw that you also do piano and painting and a lot of other artistic pursuits. I'd love to hear more about these other creative areas and how that
Mhm.
interacts with your writing, if at all.
Um, well, I'm not going to pretend I know consciously the way these various other creative pursuits interact or influence my writing, but I would say it activates the same part of the brain. Say, when I'm painting or making music or playing piano, writing, that same part of the brain is what is activated. Particularly when you get in the zone, which I imagine is something every creative can is familiar with. When you're just in this, you're deep in the well of creation, and the world around you just falls away. That's something that translates across all these various avenues of creativity for me. Yeah, that's all I can say on that topic. I don't know that there's a direct line or direct influence from making music to creating to writing stories to painting for me. I'm sure there is, but it's not something I I know consciously.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on the creative well and how you find that?
It is extremely difficult, and I imagine I liken that to some folks will call it the muse, inspiration, and much more seasoned writers would advise not to wait for inspiration to strike, but to show up every day to whatever creative work, creative endeavor you're involved in, and just start the process. And eventually, you're gonna get into that creative well where it seems like things are just flowing, the words are coming effortlessly. It's not like pulling teeth at all, but you're just the inspiration seems endless. and the supply is endless and you're really enjoying the work of creativity and there's no difficulty, so to speak. That's rare in my experience. It's really rare to achieve that. And in writing, say in a week, for example, I could have 4 writing sessions spread across 4 days. I might hit that zen one time, really. And it's really like trying to capture lightning in a bottle. But it's something I'm always chasing, and when that happens, it feels like magic really occurs. On the other hand, what's interesting is that when I read back on my work, I really can't tell where it felt like work, where it felt like pulling teeth to put the words on the page versus when I was in that the Zen mode, which which is really interesting, I guess.
Well, I feel like it is also such a mindset thing. It's like,
Hmm.
because at the end of the day, it's more about what the enjoyment of you as a writer is having. Sometimes I'll look back at the work that I felt like it was like pulling teeth to try and
Yeah.
write,
Yeah.
and that will be the best thing in the book.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. It's really crazy how that happens because sometimes I draft and I feel like the words on the page are gold, and I'm really satisfied and excited about that day's work. I come back the next day to read it, and it reads like absolute trash. And sometimes the opposite happens where it feels like it was really painful, really tough, just putting one word after the other on the page. And I come back the next day and it reads fluidly, it reads like butter, and it's just really good. Yeah. So maybe you are onto something. I feel like it's a mindset thing. Yeah. Who knows?
I used to try and trick myself while I was reading this one book. I would either write really late at night or really early in the morning. So
Hmm.
that way I was like completely foggy and tired.
Right.
And that was when I wrote the best. And
Interesting.
I'd look back and I'd go, this makes no sense.
I
How is
feel,
this
yeah,
possible?
I think that's when you're really tired or foggy, that's when your inner critic and editor sort of turns off and you let the subconscious, you let the creative side of you just do the work, unshackled by criticisms of this is bad, you should stop. So that is something I might try that sometime.
Now, when you are reading back, how do you
Mhm.
kind of control that inner editor? Do you let it run rampant during the editing process or kind of have to reel it in?
During the editing process, yes, I wanted to run rampant. But in the drafting process, again, this is something I am striving towards. I haven't achieved it yet. But in the drafting process, when I read back, because I typically read back over the previous day's work just to fall back in the groove and the voice and to continue that day's drafting, I will read back and I try to shut off the internal editor, the internal critic, not always successfully, but I guess I have been able to find sort of a balance between creativity and criticism because I know I'm not creating the story just for myself, but for an imagined audience. And really, when I write, I picture the ideal reader, my ideal reader. And, if I'm drafting a funny scene, I'm thinking, is this ideal reader going to find this funny? Are they going to find it emotional? Am I hitting all the right Are they going to react in the way I want them to react to this certain sequence or scene or whatever? So I guess when I read back on a previous day's work, I read back not as a writer, but as a reader. And if I find that I can elicit those same emotions I was trying to achieve, then that's a good day's work, I guess.
Absolutely. So, from starting this most recent book to the end of it, now where you are, what are some ways that you feel like your writing has evolved or strengthened in that time?
Hmm. So this most recent book I'm drafting is one that has definitely challenged me, and I think it's the longest really I've spent working on any one project continuously. Mostly because most of modern fiction is we have the a limited point of view, third person limited perspective, which is what we have in modern fiction or a first person perspective. But for this, I'm employing the omniscient perspective, which is not something you see often in modern. work. It was really prevalent in 18th century, 19th century literature. Now, not so much. But for that, I guess that's where the research comes in. I read lots of contemporary works, particularly the works of immortals who wrote, Rules of Civility, A Gentleman in Moscow, and really employs that omniscient perspective. And for me, that involved, well, absorbing that voice and the style in order for me to be able to write in a way that was in that manner, in a way that's convincing, that's not jarring. It's really a very thin line between omniscient point of view and head hopping, which is like the no of fiction. So for this project, yeah, that's what I really did as regards research, but also pushing myself into a new creative frontier that I'd never ventured before.
That is so interesting. Yeah, I feel like with each book, as a reader, you can tell too when writers are kind of improving. It's like, oh, they're trying out this new technique, this new style. So
Yeah.
it's interesting to hear from the writer what you were trying to accomplish, what you did accomplish with this.
Oh yeah, yeah. Because as a writer, I never want to grow complacent. I feel like with my previous works, I'd mastered certain elements, certain crafts bits, and I didn't just want to go rehashing already trodden ground, trodden concepts. I always want to challenge myself, of course, while retaining, what makes me a unique writer. Yeah, it's been a really interesting and fun exercise.
That is so interesting. Well, this has just been an excellent interview. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. I had a blast.
I just have one more question, and that is, what do you have coming up?
Well, I am working on the novel, which I just talked about. I should be done drafting that next month, and it's off to my agent for notes, and I'm really excited about that. I think it's going to be exciting, really. I am also working on a couple of short stories for anthologies. I've been asked to contribute stories to anthologies, but also thinking of the next project and the next projects. I guess it never ends. But again, this is what I do. This is what I love to do, and it's been fun for me.
That is fantastic. I hope everyone listening to this goes out, buys your books, and you're welcome back on anytime. I can't wait for this
Absolutely.
next book to come out. Sounds very good.
Thank you.
And for Read Between the Lines, my name is Molly Southgate.
And I'm Tobi Ogundiran.
Let's end this the way all great stories end. Happily ever after. The end.
Thank you for listening to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. You can follow the show on Instagram and Facebook at Read Between the Lines Podcast and on Twitter at RBTL Podcast. Make sure to follow the authors who I've been talking to hear all about their upcoming projects, and also because they're cool people. This show is hosted by me, Molly Southgate, and produced and edited by my dad, Rob Southgate. Read Between the Lines is a Southgate Media Group production, and you can find all the great content put on by the network at southgatemediagroup.com. You can read the story of how I and many other podcasters started in the anthology book Pod Life, which you'll find at the link in the show notes. Also in the show notes are links to buy the books featured on this episode. Using those links supports this show and the incredible authors being interviewed. Have a great week and keep reading.